Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I welcome all of you back to another unboxing video. You're not going to actually believe this, ladies and gentlemen, but just before I did this video, I would literally just finished and then turn the camera back on again just to make another video. I am what you might like to call a content connoisseur machine. I work just to make even more. That is honestly the start and stop of when it comes to this channel. Just make as much as you can and then make even more. And I remember like somebody speaking to me, oh yeah, I remember what this is. It was just something I saw on eBay a few days ago, and I just saw I kind of wanted to get this anyway because it's sort of relevant to a future video I wanted to do, but it's going to be like a really high effort sort of mark. Well, actually, for the most part, this entire thing that I just got is going to be useful for an appendix I'm going to write for my own like little autobiography, and a couple of it could be a couple of months, it could be maybe this time next year when I get to work on it like properly. But we'll have to wait and see for that. So that's just the bill there, so that's okay with to get rid of. And there we go. It's quite a thick one as well. It's called A State of Fear, How the UK Government Weaponized Fear During the COVID-19 Pandemic. Now, if you're quite unknown to certainly my own writings, that I've spoken a lot of the COVID pandemic over the last 2 years at this point. It's not nearly up to the level that I've seen other people being able to talk about it, but I like to imagine my opinion is, well, it could be improved, I suppose. That's the best thing I could say about my opinion. But it's what's interesting, ladies and gentlemen, is that certainly about the story I'm going to put together my own autobiography of starting from the day of my university graduation up until probably the present day, or whenever the pandemic stops. That's realistically when it starts and when it stops, because the thing about if you're wondering why I'm sort of picking my university graduation as the starting point, is because the first part of the biography literally is going to explain about the things immediately before the pandemic and then immediately after it begins. And then I might do because if I was doing the book now, I'd imagine we'd be something in the middle of perhaps the third part of this story. And I imagine I'd call this part something like They Think It's All Over. Because as August continues to wear on, and September, even though it's even just over 3 weeks away, it's gonna come here sooner or later. Because the skies are starting to get darker again at night. There seems to be a little bit of more of a chill in the air nowadays. It seems as if August has already ended, or rather summer has ended very prematurely. That seems like a bad omen to me because of, yeah, you know. Anyway, just to give you guys something I'm just going to read the back first. I want to give you guys a bit of an update in case you were interested in checking this out as well. Possible. This is a book about fear. Fear of a virus. Fear of death. Fear of losing our jobs, our democracy, our human connections, our health, and our minds. It's also about how the government weaponized our fear against us, supposedly in our best interests, until we were one of the most frightened countries in the world. But why did the government deliberately frighten us? How has this affected us as individuals and as a country? Who is involved in the decision-making that affects our lives? How are behavioral science and nudge theory being used to subliminally manipulate us? How does the media leverage work? What are the real risks up to our well-being? Ahead of any official inquiry into the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, Laura Dodsworth explores all these questions and more in a nuanced and thought-provoking discussion of an extraordinary year in British life and politics, with stories from members of the general public who were impacted by fear, anxiety, and isolation, and revealing interviews with psychologists, politicians, scientists, and lawyers, Whitehall advisors, and journalists. A State of Fear calls for a more hopeful, transparent, and effective democracy. Dark, compelling, determined and heartfelt, a timely and fascinating read. Neil Oliver, writer and broadcaster. So, I feel as if like just something to give us a little something to chew on. I think we'll do just read basically the introduction page. Well, the first 6 pages, because that leads up into the first chapter of Fright Night. So, let's do the introduction. The perceived level of personal threat needs to be increased among those who are complacent, using hard-hitting emotional messaging. From options for increasing adherence to social distancing measures by the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behavior, SPI-B, 22nd of March 2022. Introduction. This is a book about fear. Fear of a... Well, okay, we'll get to the next part. We'll sort of like skip forward to... In one of the most extraordinary documents ever revealed to the British public, the behavioural scientists advising the UK government recorded or recommended that we needed to be frightened. The Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviour, SPI-B, said in their report options for increasing adherence to social distancing measures, dated 22nd of March 2020. That a substantial number of people still do not feel sufficiently personally threatened. It could be that they are reassured by the low death rate in their demographic group, although levels of concern may be rising. As a result, they recommend that the perceived level of personal threat needs to be increased among those who are complacent, using hard-hitting emotional messaging. In essence, the government was advised to frighten the British public to encourage adherence to the emergency lockdown regulations. And frighten us they did. This book explores why the government used fear, the specific tactics, the people behind them, and the impacts of fear, including stories from people who were undone by fear during the pandemic. Most of all, this book asks you to think about the ethics of using fear to manage people. Fear is one of the most powerful of emotions, and as emotions are stronger than thoughts, fear can overpower the clearest of minds. We shouldn't feel bad about being frightened. From an evolutionary perspective, it is key to our survival. It protects us from danger, and that is precisely what makes fear one of the most powerful tools in behavioral psychology. This exploration of fear led me to interview people who have been too frightened to leave their homes all year. Conspiracy theorists, psychologists, some of the behavioral scientists who advised government scientists, politicians, doctors, pandemic planners, and journalists. By the end of March 2021, COVID had been involved in the deaths of 2.8 million people globally. The disease will continue to kill more, even though hopefully the biggest waves are behind us in the United Kingdom. The aim of this book is not to refute that COVID-19 is anything but a serious disease that has killed people, most particularly the elderly and those with certain underlying health conditions, especially dementia, Alzheimer's, obesity, diabetes, and hypertensive diseases, among others. The aim of this book is to explore our fear response, and whether it was ethical and wise for the government to deliberately frighten the population. Was the government's response proportional? Wouldn't people have cautiously tempered their behaviour during an epidemic, in the interest of self-preservation and community spirit? What are the unintended consequences of frightening a population? In the years and inquiries to follow, the management of this epidemic must be facetiously and honestly examined. A state of fear asks those who are also integrated the behavioral science approach to managing people's emotions and behavior. COVID-19 has become one of the many endemic viruses we have to live with. It was known from the beginning to be a very mild illness for nearly all of us. The UK's chief scientific advisor, Patrick Vallance, stated this publicly on the 13th of March 2020. Experience has proven that correct. COVID was not lethal or dangerous to the vast majority. Vaccines and treatments were developed at miraculous speed to protect the vulnerable. So, what are we still afraid of? The third wave, a fourth wave, a fifth wave? Winter recurrences, mutations, future viruses, and the unknown haunt us. From roadside signs telling us to stay alert, the incessantly doom-laden media commentary, to masks literally keeping the fear in our face, we've become afraid of each other. Humans are now vectors of transmission, agents of disease. We have become afraid of our own judgment about how to manage the minute of our lives. From whom to hug, to whether or to share a serving spoon. Apparently, we even need guidance about whether we can sit next to a friend on a bench. But perhaps we need to be more afraid of how easily manipulated we can be. Some will believe that leveraging our fear can be justified if it is in our best interests. If you agree that COVID-19 is the biggest threat this country has faced in peacetime history, as the government asserted in its consultation documents, changes to human medicine regulations to support the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines, you might think it was not only acceptable but desirable to scare the British public into complying with regulations that resulted in the greatest imposition on our liberty in peacetime. If you obtained all your information about the epidemic from Number 10, press briefings that might be your mindset, tactics to quell debate, and censor dissent mean that information presented in this book many may feel new, even challenging. It can be psychologically uncomfortable to encounter contradictory information. We don't like to believe we can be manipulated, let alone that we have been manipulated. This book may hurt. People vastly overestimated the spread and the deadliness of COVID-19. One survey in July 2020 showed that the British public thought 6 to 7% of the whole population had died from coronavirus, around 100 times the actual death rate at the time based on official figures. That would have been about 4.5 million bodies. We'd have noticed, don't you think? It was reported in January 2021 that the COVID epidemic caused excess deaths to November to rise to the highest level in the UK since the Second World War. This was headline news throughout the UK media. However, once the age and size of the population was taken into account, excess deaths were at their worst since 2008. That is very significant, and show that just over a decade of public health improvements have been undone, but less hyperbolic than the headlines. In September 2020, the British people were also more concerned about the spread of the virus than people in Sweden, the US, France, Germany, and Japan. 83% of us thought that we would be in a second wave, while only 21% of us thought the government was well prepared to deal with it. An international study of public attitudes across Europe, America, and Asia found that people in the UK had the highest overall levels of concern about COVID, and yet another study reported that Britons were the least likely to believe that the economy and businesses should open if COVID was not fully contained. We were the most frightened population in the world. By February 2021, we had one of the most rapid and comprehensive vaccination programs in the world, yet also the most stringent lockdown in the developed world. People are notoriously bad at judging risk and numbers, but we are substantially overestimated the dangers, and this wasn't helped by the daily reports from the government and media. We heard about new cases, but never recoveries. Hospital admissions, but not discharges, were reported. We were given numbers of daily deaths, but largely without the context that about 1,600 people die every day in the UK anyway. By the end of March 2021, just 689 people under the age of 60 with no comorbidities had died from COVID in England and Wales, according to NHS England. The average age of death with coronavirus is 82.3 years of age. 1 year more than average life expectancy in Britain. Of course, all the deaths associated with COVID count, but if these facts had been widely reported and people had realized it was a disease which was primarily dangerous to the elderly and otherwise unwell, then a substantial number of people would probably not feel sufficiently personally threatened. One government report said that lockdown could cause 200,000 people to die as a result of delays in healthcare and economic effects, also equating to 1 million years of life lost. Another study at Bristol University estimated an average 500,000 and 60,000 lives lost caused by the reduced economic activity during lockdown. Due to the well-understood link between wealth and health, quite simply, people in rich nations live longer. The government, public health bodies, and the media used alarmist language throughout the epidemic. Big numbers, steep red lines on graphs, the use of selective information, careful psychological messaging, and emotive advertising created a blitzkrieg of daily fear bombs. This is a book about fear, not about data. Nevertheless, some additional data will be required to help. You contextualize the threat of the disease with the policies for managing it, and you will find it in Appendix 1. A few facts and figures assist with framing the scale and dangers of COVID, and subsequently with asserting whether escalating our fears was appropriate or not. It is partly an issue in proportion and the entirety an issue of ideology. But the numbering risks ignore the more poignant human costs of the use of fear. I interview people who were driven by fear, anxiety, and isolation to develop agoraphobia, obsessive-compulsive disorders, panic attacks, started self-harming, and even attempted suicide. How do we weigh the potential life saved from COVID-19 with a life deliberately ended by overdosing in a hotel room or jumping from a bridge? Can we justify protecting someone from physical sickness, fever, and fatigue if the methods of protecting caused someone else to develop a fear of leaving their house, or made them waken sick with dread every day? Epidemics will come and go. Our basic psychology is here to stay. The pressing issue is whether and how we permit behavioral psychologists, the government, and the media to manipulate our psychology. At times, the expertise and experience of the pandemic has felt like a story or like living in a movie, not a fun one. While the virus was the plot device in our fantastical reality, the motivating force for many of the characters was fear. The best macabre fairy tales were also cautionary tales. If you can identify the big bad wolf and understand what he represents and wants, you can find your way through the dark woods and be free. We don't know how this will end, but rather than wait till it's all over to tell the terrible story of when the world stopped and humanity was paralyzed with fear, I would like to invite you to decide how the story ends. There is still time for us to craft the happy ending of our choice. Shouldn't we be the authors of our own stories? As Carl Augustus Menninger said, fears are educated into us, and can, if we wish, be educated out. We need to inoculate ourselves against fear. And I will simply leave you, ladies and gentlemen, with some very choice words from Boris Johnson. The coronavirus is the biggest threat this country has faced for decades. All over the world, we are seeing the devastating impact of this invisible killer. From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home. From Boris Johnson's speech to the nation, 23rd of March 2020. I should know, ladies and gentlemen, I've been there. I've seen the speech myself. And I was, admittedly, very scared myself. Though I could almost imagine, in some parallel universe, the Scarecrow from the DC universe was the one responsible, and he caused people to be afraid. An epidemic based on fear. Or rather, we've turned it into one of fear. But with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that's given you guys something to think about, and it's going to give me quite a lot more to think about in the next coming days, because I'm going to read through the rest of State of Fear, and I'm going to leave probably my first book review on this channel. So look forward to that, and I'll look forward to seeing all of you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.